Good morning, everybody. Welcome on behalf of the California Council on Teacher Education Board of Directors and the Fall Conference team. We are excited that you are taking time out of your busy schedule, particularly as I know for most of us who are on the semester system, we are right at the end of our semester right now. So I know you're very busy, but thank you for joining us for this first in our series of virtual research roundtable discussions. As we're getting started, please feel free to drop your name and where you're joining us from into the chat so we can build a little bit of community. A couple of things I just want to acknowledge because they're in the space for me is this is the 8th anniversary of the shootings at Sandy Hook. My nephew was a second grader at Sandy Hook. So I have a lot of big feelings today. And I think that's all tied to our collective work in education, where this panel is on anti-racism and culturally sensitive initiatives in teacher education. And I think one of the things we have to recognize is, there's a lot of secondary trauma that happens for a variety of reasons in schools. And so I just want to put that in the space. The other thing is, because it may be in the space for some of you as well, the other thing that I wanted to put in the space is just to honor and recognize that we are all on Indigenous lands. And so if when you're dropping in the chat, you want to drop not only where you're from, but if you know the occupied Indigenous land that you are on, please feel free to drop that in the chat as well. I think it's always important to remember that we are on this land, but it is not ours. So just those couple of things. So again, for folks who are just joining us, please feel free to drop your name and where you're joining us from in the chat. My name is Dr. Betina Hsieh. I am a professor and the director of teacher education at the Lefebvre College of Education at the University of Laverne. I am also a board member for CCTE. And today we'll be hearing from a series of presenters around the topic of anti-racist and culturally sensitive initiatives in teacher education. As I explained a little earlier to some of our presenters, each group of presenters, each paper will have 5 minutes to present a bit about their research. And then we'll have a couple of moderated questions that I've prepared, and then we'll open it up for discussion between the panelists and also Q&A from the audience. We are a small enough group today at 24 that I hope that we'll be able to engage in conversation with each other. I will introduce each presentation group before they speak, and then I'll be happy to facilitate the moderated questions and the Q&A. So thank you again all so much for joining us this Monday morning. So the first invited presenters that I would like to invite to present are Heather Ballinger, Libbi Miller, Jim Woglom, and Sarah Green from Humboldt State. Their paper is entitled Plan, Do, Study, Act, Utilizing Improvement Science Methods to Identify and Dismantle Systemic Inequities in Teacher Education, Admissions, and Recruitment. And I'll go ahead and start your 5 minutes. And when you're getting close to the time, I will just send a private message to Libbi, because I know her best out of your group, and let you know you have about 30 seconds to wrap up. So please take it away.
Thank you, Betina. And this will just be a casual introduction and informal introduction to the work that we've been doing. We began this journey with improvement science about 2 years ago through the NGEI mini grant, and then working with the Improvement Research Fellowship, and then on to the CO Learning Lab for Improvement. So I know that several of you in the CSU system have also been working with those initiatives. Much of this work really began by understanding our system that was in place, and we spent a lot of time utilizing fishbone diagrams and developing driver diagrams to start to understand how our system was perpetuating systemic racism and systemic inequalities. Then we began to use Plan, Do, Study, Act cycles in order to try to test different change ideas. We also conducted empathy interviews, focus groups, and process mapping to really engage in that system inquiry. In our empathy interviews, I'll let my team share share more about these if they would like. But in our empathy interviews, we were able to talk to students and talk to members of our staff and faculty to really understand how our system impacted their experience in admissions and recruitment to our program. And I'd like to just open it up to members of my team to share a little bit more about this journey.
Yeah, I mean, I think one of the things that was really exciting for me about this work is coming to collaboratively understand the systems that we have existing within our institution in a really nuanced way and in a critical way so that we could determine where there were leverage points for increasing access and equity within our structure. And it also, I think it brought a bunch of realizations to examples. We discovered that emails weren't necessarily going to the correct people. When you signed up and did your application for HSU, it sent your I guess confirmation to an email that was assigned to you when you applied. As such, they were sending the confirmation to an email people didn't know they even had. We talked to some people about their access and comfort within the application process, and there was concerns about our interview questions and the framing. The students felt that the framing around those interview questions kind of denoted that it was framed for white students thinking about their multicultural competencies, and as such was an uncomfortable space for students of color. So just critically thinking about our structures and the way they might be, where there might be places to improve towards further equity.
I think the other interesting PDSA that we did was we gave presentations to our undergraduate pathways for education majors, and we realized that we wanted to strengthen the connections between those groups. And so we've made a couple of changes, including having regular meetings with our undergraduate pathway advisors so that we can keep them kind of in the loop about our program, and we're trying to currently find a way to loop in our seniors and possibly have them start taking potentially classes that could get them interested in the credentialing program, or help them take some of the coursework that they are required to take, and try to kind of double get interested in teaching and learn a little bit more about it before they actually begin the program, and try to lessen the load of that kind of intense academic year that our credential candidates encounter.
Something that we're currently working on is adjusting our application process as well. So we adjusted our application so that it's a little more accessible and it takes less energy to complete, and we're going to open up a different way for students to submit their program requirements, and in hopes that that will help. So that's a kind of an in-progress test that we're doing right now.
Thank you all. I know we're just about out of time. I think one of my biggest takeaways is that there's so much we didn't know about our program going into this work, and we can't fix what we don't know. So really learning about our program and then doing these small tests of changes and looking at their impact on our student experience has been so important in changing the way that we think about our improvement work.
Great, thank you so much to the team from Humboldt State. Next, I'd like Lara Ervin-Kassab, Karen Escalante, and Daniel Soodjinda will present their paper considering the role of the Cal TPA in fostering conversations about anti-racism and the future of teacher education.
Thank you, Betina. And I do want to acknowledge you on this anniversary. I know that's a tough one to sit through. So I'm holding a space for you at this moment, and will continue to do so today. So, and thank you for sharing that with us. I didn't know that about you. So in regards to our research that Daniel, Lara, and I have worked on, so the three of us have all been involved in CalTPA in some capacity for a number of years now. Daniel and I were on the design team. We have all at one point or continue to do so are still involved as lead assessors, as leads. We have trained individuals. We have provided the supports at our campus, TPA coordinators, quite immersed, for better or worse, in CalTPA. And so one of the things, because of our experience in CalTPA, one of the things that the three of us decided upon this summer is, let's look at the language of CalTPA and see how it helps prepare our candidates for the teaching profession. So based on the work of Sonia Nieto, we know that California proclaims to be socially just, but do our educator preparation programs really instill that? Is it in word and deed? What's really happening there? And because so many teacher candidates in California do need to take the CalTPA, it's either the EdTPA, the Fresno assessment, or CalTPA, we knew that every candidate in California needs to take a performance assessment. And because of our experience with CalTPA, we decided to explore the CalTPA's language and whether it helps produce teachers with an anti-racist framework. So we've been working on a document analysis of cycle 1 so far. There's cycle 1 and cycle 2 of CalTPA. And we're specifically looking at the language used. We know that in our profession, and this has been an ongoing problem, that every educator, every school district, every teacher education program operationalizes language in a very different capacity. So one of the things we are really looking to do is, okay, this terminology, what does it mean at this campus? What does it mean at this campus? And how do we operationalize it so that our candidates across the state are prepared in the same capacity to be anti-racist educators? Most of our K-12 educators are white females, such as myself, and we go through a K-12 system that is infused in white supremacy. So our candidates come into teacher education programs indoctrinated in this white supremacist framework. So there's a lot of undoing we need to do in teacher education programs. And one way that we decided, Lara, Daniel, and I decided that we could take a look at this and really start to shift this mindset, this white supremacist mindset, is using the CalTPA language, because it is something that every candidate needs to do. It's an opportunity for us to operationalize how the language is used, focus on these asset pedagogies, and prepare candidates to enter the profession and undo so many of those stances that have been withstood for centuries. So that's really where this came to be. And I will let Daniel and Lara add anything else that they would like to this introduction of our work.
So thanks, Karen. I'll say that I want to be clear in that we are not arguing that the CalTPA in itself produces anti-racist teachers who understand how to confront white supremacy. We're not saying that in any way. It's all about how the programs approach the CalTPA, whether it be before or after student or during student teaching, and how they prepare them in a way that, like Karen said, operationalize some of the concepts and terms that are in the assessment itself. So you can get away from passing and pass the CalTPA, a candidate can, and still, quite frankly, be a racist teacher who teaches from an asset-based lens. Like, that's possible, right? So we are just saying that it is all about how programs prepare candidates to approach the CalTPA and how they can use it as a platform to have these sort of anti-racist discussions in their class, which is really what needs to happen. And I know that, and I have about 30 seconds left, and I'll just say that the whole reason why I think I decided to join the design team was because in my head, the one way that you could change teacher education so that it moves away from deficit framing to asset-oriented lenses to anti-racist lenses, the one way you can do that is through an assessment that looks at all candidates in different programs across the state and says, hey, we're going to hold you to these standards. And so if we hold you to these standards, we can actually ask you to look at your curriculum and change it, because we know that academic freedom actually protects you from doing that at your own institutions, which is kind of difficult and to unpack. But yeah, thank you.
Lara, did you want to chime in before we move to the next folks?
Oh, I was putting it in the chat because I knew we were out of time. So I'll go ahead and finish in the chat.
Okay, perfect. Thank you so much. All right, so we'll move. Thank you very much, Lara, Karen, and Daniel. We'll move next to Gregory Richardson from Cal State San Bernardino, whose paper is called Portrayals of Black Men and Boys in Media, Narratives Intended to Inhibit Positive Societal Contribution.
Thank you very much, and good morning again to everyone. I'm excited about this opportunity to share my research in this particular area, something that's been dear to my heart over the years. As a young man raised in South Central, I began to notice several iniquities that existed in the system. And I was wondering if it was just my perception or if it was just the way things existed. And so I began to look closely at a number of different things. And one of the things that I began to realize was that the portrayals of Black men and boys in media was predominantly negative. Even when there were societal contributions by Black men and boys that were positive, those were usually downplayed and shortly lived. And so I began to document what I saw in the different areas of media. And I realized that systemic racism existed. As a young man, I realized moving from South Central to Gardena that the world was different and the insight on education was different. The accessibility to resources were different. And so this began to open up a whole new realm. And as I began to traverse through life, I realized that as I looked at the problem, a number of things existed. So in my basic foundation for the framework, I realized that there are historical narratives and there are also things associated with the African-American movement in the United States. As a historical narrative, one of the things that struck out was that Blacks were considered 3/5 of a person. And I was wondering how that could actually exist. Well, it had to do with the House of Representatives and taxation. But then I realized that Lincoln in 1861 had a big push to enable Blacks to leave the country if they desired. And Marcus Garvey was one of the individuals that tried to move in this endeavor. And his work was actually at its apex around 1920. But I began to look at historical things from a 50-year perspective, starting with the emancipation. And I saw in the 1920s, the Harlem Renaissance and how there were very successful Blacks in a number of different areas, intellectually, socially, monetary-wise, and so forth. But very little was said about that. And over the years, Blacks were basically considered inferior in so many different ways. In the late 60s, James Brown, a singer, had a song that was very popular, was I'm Black and I'm Proud. And that brought a lot of positive esteem to individuals. But then when we looked at the things in the 20s, in the 21st century, Eric Gardner, Michael Brown, Walter Scott, and others who were killed by police who were supposed to protect individuals, I started looking at things. And as I looked at the system, I saw that there were stolen achievements also that existed. Stolen achievements in the area of, for instance, Bass Reeves was a law officer, a marshal, who had over 3,000 arrests. Well, he is really the Lone Ranger, but details exist there that don't portray that. Solomon Linde, who was the author and the singer of The Lion Sleeps Tonight, never got much credit for the work that he did, but that made millions of dollars for Disney. And so I started looking at the media conglomerates that basically control things: Disney, National Amusements, Time Warner, Comcast, News Corp, Sunny. And I realized that these individuals that were at the top, the CEOs, their leaders, they were making millions of dollars, $44.9 million, $22 million a year. That's what their salary was. What they were making that in the salary, you can imagine how much money these conglomerates were making in totality. And I began to realize that I looked closely at literature, and I realized I got about maybe 1 or 2 minutes left. And in looking at literature, I saw one of my children's Encyclopedia Britannica years ago, and I'm very keen on observation. And I noticed that there was a picture of a young man looking at something, and I looked in the picture with the lined up with a ruler, and it was a derogatory statement. And I started looking at other pictures and media things, and there was a lot of negative portrayals that were indicated in the literature that would affect not only the majority population, but even African-American young men, to the point that they don't esteem to try to do successful things. And as a person, African-American, I had to fight against what the system was saying who I should be. In wrapping things up, my research indicated that there is systemic racism in the system, and it has a lot to do with what the teachers are exposed to. And I think we need to really change the ideology of the teacher's mindset on racism and the majority culture as only being the major contributors. And once we can do that, I think we can turn the tide as to giving African-American Black men and boys to do work for what they have done. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Greg. You were great on timing. Excellent. So really appreciate all of these rich research presentations. Our final research presentation is from Allison Smith and Melissa Meetze-Hall, and they will be presenting their paper, Bridging Anti-Racism Pedagogy Across Teacher Pre-Service and In-Service Programs, the Importance of Collaborative Solutions to Deepen Teacher Practice in situ.
Okay, thank you. So I'm Allison Smith and Melissa Meetze-Hall. So I come from teacher preparation, and Melissa comes from the induction world. And our work is on the collaboration and how effective and powerful that can be. And right now, oftentimes the work done in induction and pre-service, despite all of our effort is developing teachers, we're really working in those. And recently, we've been kind of forced into increased collaboration with the governor's executive order, Cal TPA and Ed TPA being switched from the preliminary credential requirement to clearing. Induction programs are working more in that pre-service world because of the pandemic that we're in. This can be seen as an aid, but I think, and Melissa and I feel that this is actually an opportunity. So we can work together in really supporting these anti-racism skills and understanding throughout the teacher's profession. So are we talking about it in the same ways? And we were talking, are we operationalizing it not only across pre-service, but also in induction? And what if we were all kind of working together in the same ways to be a little more powerful with how we are developing teachers? And so that's the work. We're doing our research, understanding where our candidates are right now in induction and what they're kind of gleaning from their experience. And so pre-service, we have the Cal TPA, we have focus on asset-based language, funds of knowledge, these types of kind of foundational knowledge that should be, now we don't know if this is happening across the state, but it should be foundational to the teacher preparation experience throughout the arc of the program, and really empower them through their induction program. So we're looking at our candidates in induction. So Melissa, you can take it from there about the induction world.
Great, thank you. So I think one thing I want to bring into the space is just this reminder, and I know that you all have heard this, but when a candidate reaches induction, the induction program is intended to be self-selected focus of inquiries. So I heard a lot of, I love to listen for the connections. So I heard from Humboldt that you're using focus groups and using inquiry, and myself having done some of the Cal TPA and now I'm doing the Cal APA work. I heard, you know, of course, our asset pedagogies and the asset-oriented lens. All that being wonderful, and let's make that, well, it's not probably accurate, but let's make that positive presupposition that all of our candidates are coming out and they've really honestly self-assessed. But then they get to induction and they self-assess again, and they get largely to guide those inquiries. So in our program, we have very large numbers of candidates. They're going to self-assess on the CSTPs, which are very similar and aligned to the teacher performance expectations. But then they're going to take input from their site administrator. They're going to pay attention to the district initiatives. They're going to be in conversation with their reflective coach or their mentor. And then they're going to decide their way forward in these inquiries. And what we don't know yet, we know, I know in my program that I have 52 folks thus far who are going to engage in a specific inquiry on anti-racism and further developing themselves. And I have a colleague in the space who's helped me pull those numbers. So a big shout out to Sylvia there for helping me with this. So what I know is I have 52 folks for some reason have been called to this inquiry. I don't know yet until I conduct my interviews. And Allison and I still have some work to do on that. COVID has slowed us down a bit, but I don't know if it's because there was a deep understanding and a calling that was instilled in them. I don't know. Thanks, Betina, about a minute. I don't know. We don't know yet if they are in this context and the context that they find themselves working in their first teaching job, as to whether it's not what they thought it was going to be. Maybe they're investigating because they expected more colleagues on their campus to be paying attention and to be talking about students in this asset-focused perspective. Or it might be the counter of that. So I'm really excited to know and to learn what called them to this inquiry in particular, and then find out what was their experience. And that's Allison's and my work. I know what did they experience in their pre-service, and then how can we strengthen this induction experience, which of course we think will carry them forward in a very positive way. At least that's what I hope I learn. So thank you very much.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Melissa and Allison. We were going to have one final paper from Erin Whitney, Catherine Lemmy, and Elizabeth Stevens at Cal State Chico on infusing culturally sustaining pedagogies into foundational literacy courses for pre-service teachers. Unfortunately, those presenters were unable to make our conversation today, but I did want to acknowledge their paper and presentation, and I hope that you'll check out not only their paper, but all of the presenters that gave their short synopsis today. I found all of your synopses super interesting, and it makes me want to go back and look at your videos some more to deepen my understanding of the work that you've done. As I mentioned earlier, we're going to have a couple of moderated questions, and then I'm going to open it up for Q&A. Feel free to drop any questions that you have into the chat. And also, any kind of feedback that you have as well for the presenters. One of the things that struck me from these presentations was, so often we talk about kind of individual anti-racist action. And what really struck me from this group of presenters is the focus on structural shifts, right? And you talked about structural shifts at multiple levels: program level, state accreditation requirements, societal level. Greg's piece was really, about media representation broadly, and the university district partnerships. So one of the questions I had for our panelists today is, given your various positionalities, your work, and your institutions, what advice might you give for teacher educators? And I mean that broadly, because as Melissa and Allison talked about, we're doing the work of teacher education both at the university and in districts, right? So what advice might you give for teacher educators who are working towards addressing inequities, decolonizing their own practice, and engaging in deeply anti-racist practices, both at the individual and systemic levels? And I'll drop that question in the chat because I know it's a many-part question, so you may need to look at it before you're able to answer, but feel free to jump in, any of the panelists.
So I'll go ahead and get us started. And just so everyone knows, I actually have a severe vision problem. So if you were about to say something and I jumped in over you, I'm really sorry. But I can't see you. So, so in thinking about this, I think it's like we have to approach the whole question from a multiple level perspective. And again, one of the things that struck me from all of our presentations was one of the conversations Danielle and Karen and I have been having is that a lot of the language that are in the TPAs, that are in the CST, that are present when we're talking about preparing future teachers are all coming out of the standards, the teacher performance expectations, the CSTPs, and recognizing that these are things that while they were written collaboratively and democratically, ultimately they were finalized in an institutional way. So I think it's a two-pronged approach in that we want to foster our own and our own future teachers' personal reflections, personal monitoring, and questioning of their reactions and work, but also to recognize that we're working within a system that may or may not be as anti-racist. The language may not lend itself to anti-racism as much as we would like it to. So recognizing that we need to push back on those standards that kind of rule our lives is sort of where I'm going with that.
And I'm not sure if anyone else was jumping in. I want to add, and I was reading your question again, Betina, in regards to the various positionalities, and you point something out that just kind of sat with me. These presentations are from entry into teacher education to beyond, right? Because we're looking at media during teacher education and then after. And Libby and friends, as you were talking, I thought about our application process as well. And I was recently appointed to multiple subject coordinator. So now I have all this insight that I didn't want, but now I have it because of course it creates more work, right? But into how candidates are applying and really the hangups that occur before they can even be entered into the program. And listening to you talk about it, I watched your presentation, but listening to you talk about it again, and then hearing Betina really summarize this beginning to end type of thing in our teacher education programs. I mean, we are causing challenges for our candidates to even enter the program for a variety of reasons, which of course is a challenge for first generation college students. And so it's interesting that you bring that up. It just kind of sat with me a little bit more today, realizing I get emails from candidates all the time that don't know how to enroll, don't check their university email, don't know how to do X, Y, and Z because they just haven't had the opportunity or the experience. And so Betina, I appreciate the way you framed that question. So I guess it really sat well with me in terms of reflection. So thank you.
Thanks, Karen. And Greg, I saw you unmute, so I'm going to call on you next. And then Melissa, I see you too.
Is this a good time for me to chime in, or did I miss it? Okay, great. I just want to speak briefly about the question and indicate that I see the systemic racism prevalent, and one of the ways that I see that it can be resolved is through teacher preparation programs. Teachers touch every occupation. In someone's classroom is the next president of the United States, the next CEO of the largest manufacturing company, and so on and so forth. And so the information that teachers share with their students is very important. I believe that teacher candidates need to approach the curriculum and the resources they use in the curriculum as they would any research. Things are continually changing, and you want to make sure you have up-to-date information. And so it's a ongoing research process, which teachers need to incorporate multicultural education and the different contributors to multicultural education. In every field, if you're teaching about economics, they can say, okay, well, normally most of the information is coming from the majority culture, but I'm going to make a point to only use 50% of what I share with the class from the majority culture. I'm going to seek and find contributions in economics from other ethnicities so that I can give a total view of what's going on. And I think this would really help our teachers in their preparation understand that here in America, that there's a systemic racism that exists, and that the classroom, particularly K-12, and it moves on above to post-secondary education as well, is basically the bed that breeds that inequity that shouldn't exist.
Thank you so much. Melissa, I saw you unmute. So did you want to add something as well?
I'm going to go ahead and use the chat feature. Thank you. But let me think about or add to retention ideas as well. Okay, so support for our teachers. Who are we losing? Are we losing the disproportionate number of teachers of color? And then, of course, why and what can we do to support?
That's a great question. I want to be on this panel. I'm like, oh, that's what my research is about. But I am not on this panel, so I'm not going to center myself. I'm going to move to the next question. And then hopefully when we open it up for discussion, I know that many of you who are in the room actually do research in this area. You are drawn to this. This is a personal commitment. I know Etta dropped her forthcoming book, which is addressing these issues that we're talking about in the chat. And so I know there's a lot of expertise here. So I promise that we'll get to actually share out in more of a conversation in just a minute. I had one more question for the panelists though. I wanted to ask about the challenges you faced, because I think sometimes when we present on our research, we're talking about kind of the things that we've identified. And I think both Karen and Greg talked about, the extra work that comes when you see the inequities, and now so, as Maya Angelou has taught us, when you know better, do better, right? Like you have to do better because you've done this research and you've engaged in this research. And so I want to ask you about the challenges you faced in unearthing and confronting these systemic inequalities. And, Daniel mentioned, when you see them, people can still have asset-based lenses and not be anti-racist, right? Like people can, and they think, and, there's this self-evaluation component where it's like, well, I think I'm doing great and I think I'm anti-racist, but we don't really know. And so I wanted to ask how you've handled challenges you faced as you unearth and confront these systemic inequalities, both on personal and professional levels, and what advice you might give us. And I'll drop that in the chat as well.
I'll start unless anyone else wants to. I think one of the biggest challenges that I've seen, especially since COVID sort of hit and all of the more recent like webinars that have taken place around anti-racist work in teacher education and K-12 specifically, is this sort of like what I would call like infighting that occurs among people who do social justice work and the best approach to take. I see it as like there's sort of like these two types of social justice activists or teacher educators, those who are really interested in sort of confronting the issue like white supremacy and calling out people and policies, and they're out on the streets and they're protesting. And then you also have people that are a little bit more diplomatic that sort of take the infiltrate and disrupt approach. And sort of when they disagree with each other and say that, you know, our way is better than your way, not realizing that what ends up happening is it's almost like that's what they want us to do. You know, that's what, quite frankly, white supremacy wants us to do as social justice sort of activists, right? Is they want us to fight with each other so that we don't get anything done. And so what I've come to realize is that, you know, is that it's important that we actually need both types of people. You actually need people that are on the streets, that are doing the demonstrations, that are protesting, that are calling out people. But then you also need people who understand the importance of infiltrating policy and spaces and systems and then disrupting from within. Because I think that in order for us to actually get any of this work done, you have to work together. And there is no one right way to do this type of work. But it's just sort of the spectrum that we need to sort of, where we listen to and learn from each other, that is the most important. But I've faced that challenge in seeing people sort of be critical of each other and me, so yeah.
I'll add, Betina, unless someone else was about to talk, I apologize. Personal and professional. So as I already identified, I am a white female named Karen. So I just have a big old target on my back. This requires a lot of work. I was part of this K-12 system that was infused in white supremacy. So it's taken me, it's been a journey to really unearth these ideas and kind of, whoa, smack myself in the face of, I have benefited from this. How do I now challenge these ideas? How do I now incorporate these ideas into everything that I teach? And so I really looked at my syllabi this semester, and in previous semesters, but even more so this semester, having done some of this work and really studying some of these anti-racist pedagogies, abolitionist pedagogies, asset-oriented pedagogies, and have reframed and revised my syllabi, change a lot of the language that I use when I'm preparing teacher candidates. And I also walk my dogs every night. That's my reflection time. And that's an opportunity for me to, okay, what have I read today? What have I listened to? What have I talked about that I can really reflect on and continue to make those shifts in the work that I do? Because I am a white woman. And so I have experienced the world very differently. And I'll give a shout out to my colleague, Daniel, that loves to provide me with some lenses sometimes, and I am grateful. He does it in a very kind and kind and gentle way, but also will challenge me, and I appreciate individuals that provide that opportunity to me, because sometimes I see it very differently. And so for those that are willing and able to call me out and challenge any of my ideas, I am always grateful.
Karen, first of all, I'd like to applaud what you're doing, as well as the work of Daniel and others. But Karen, I know there are other things that you face that people may not realize because of, like you say, you're a white female. And so keep up the good work. In regards to the challenges, Daniel talked about some of these, but I like to just reemphasize, we do need to make a concerted effort to understand that the work that we endeavor to do requires people from different walks and different approaches, and that we need to respect them and support them as much as possible. Like Daniel mentioned, there's some that might hold a picket sign and others might do it through their scholarship, but the fight is continuing. And the thing is, I would encourage each of us to never give up. The system that we are trying to change, change is difficult for people, even though that's the only constant change. But to change things, we have to do it slowly sometimes, but never stop. And eventually the clock will move from the front of the classroom where everyone's watching it to the back where you can get things done and people not focus upon the time. We have to make sure that we do what we can. There's so much that has to be done, but the work that we're doing cannot be negated or considered insignificant, because in order to build any structure, it starts with the foundation. And sometimes the foundation has to go, the deeper the foundation, the higher the structure. And every element that builds that foundation is of significant importance. Thank you.
Yeah, I have I think extending from what Gregory is saying, I think institutional reluctance to change is something that we need to confront constantly in our work. Critical change, because to a couple of people's points, I don't think a lot of that reluctance is in one individual person necessarily, but just in the difficulties of making these kind of large glacial movements in our systems. So focusing on those daily mitigative actions that we can critically use to change how we do things from day to day will hopefully eventually move us to those points where we can change the entire institution. And thinking about those things, never losing the eye on the systemic change, but making sure that you show up and do the work every day. Or I don't know, Betina Love had that metaphor about eating an elephant one bite at a time, and it's a gross metaphor, but I do think it's kind of part of the praxis is showing up and doing a little bit.
Lara, did you want to share a concrete example with us?
Yeah, so specifically the research that Daniel and Karen and I are doing right now, I'm a person who likes to collaborate and kind of test and have community around ideas. So early on in our research, we had a deep conversation around the term English language learner, which is in the standards and it's also in the TPAs, all of them. And what that means as opposed to bi or multilingual, right? And so it's a word, but it's an important word. And when I went to some of my faculty, they were all on board with let's all shift over to multilingual instead of English learner. And some of the other faculty said, well, we think that's a great idea, but we don't think the candidates are going to understand when the TPA is asking for English learners. So this is one of those barrier moments, right? When the Cal TPA is asking for you to reflect on how you're meeting the needs of your English language learner. So I thought I would take it to my students, and I created a systemic problem of practice conversation where we talked about what does it mean to think about our students as English learners? What does it mean to think about our students as multi or bilingual? And which of those terms is asset-based and which one is more deficit-based? And there was some really rich conversation where students were very much struggling because as products of this K-12 system, all of us, we don't even recognize necessarily until we really stop and think about it that we could be using a term other than English language learner. And that has led to like all of my students now refuse to use the word English language learner. And it was their choice. So this is a place where we can be struggling with things, and if we actually make our candidates or our pre-service or in-service teachers partners in these conversations, right? It's not just us reflecting on our own experiences, which is very important to do, but if we really want to address the systemic nature, we need to be pulling it to where we're all getting better insight from communicating with each other. So that's just a concrete example of this specific work that we're doing right now and how I kind of probably jumped the gun on bringing it into my classroom.
No, thank you so much, Lara. And I agree that conversation around emergent or developing multilingual or bilingual students is such an important shift, and one that honestly, I think it's very deficit framing, like to say that candidates can't adapt their language and understand that, like, here's the language that the TPA is going to say, and here's the language that like is asset-based, that actually positions students as having language and acquiring another language. So Melissa, I saw your hand, and I know Brian dropped a question in the chat, so which is actually towards you, but I think we can open up to everybody. So we'll kind of start opening up our Q&A here as well. So Melissa, do you want to go ahead and say whatever you want to say, and then we'll open up the Q&A.
Okay, I wanted to share across the state, we have seen some relabeling now, where that's going. But nonetheless, so at the state level, multilingual education is now maybe the department names. I know that in San Bernardino County, our what had been our English language learner team, they are now our multilingual team. So we'll see what we do with that, Laura. So good points on that. And then I didn't read the question, so Betina, help me here.
I can either read it, Melissa, or Brian. Do you want to unmute and go ahead and ask your question?
Sure. Yeah, no problem. So Melissa, I was just wondering, you were talking about the teacher induction inquiries, and I was wondering if you had any like specific examples of what types of inquiries teachers are undertaking. And then you mentioned you'd compiled some resources, and I was just wondering if we could get access to
that. There's the standards. If we think about the standards, the program standards, those are kind of the floor. So we, in our program, our candidates engage in 4 inquiries per year. And what we do is we provide them with a list of resources. So I'm looking at so let me go back a half step, sorry. We organize our inquiry ideas or topics, if you will, around the CSTPs. And this year we added several new inquiries, and the one that I'm focusing on, Allison and I have been working with, is how can I become an anti-racist? And an inquiry can take 4 to 6 weeks. It can be longer. So it's not probably how can I become, but how can I start to become? But a lot of resources we have. We actually have our letter from CCTE that was put out in June. That's a resource for them to read. So our CCTE statement, Guide to Equity and Anti-Racism for Educators. I've got about 40 different titles. A lot of it is reading. And then the next level, so we want them to start off by learning about something. So if we think about that cycle, they're going to investigate. So they're going to read, they're going to think about what they can bring into their teaching space. I don't have an abundance right now of materials to use with students at different levels. So this is really about them sharpening their focus. And as Karen said, really thinking about their journey. That's where we have them start. I believe, and I need Allison's help, we listed my resources somewhere, right, on our presentation? Or maybe not.
Yes, I can't recall exactly where it's at. But I do want to add right now that working with Melissa and collaborating has been really insightful from the teacher preparation perspective. I didn't realize how little I actually knew about induction. And I'm in clinical practice. We're literally handing over the baton of teacher development from pre-service to induction And I did not have the knowledge. And so learning about the different inquiries and the focus and the support and induction just really helped me with how I kind of viewed what we were doing in teacher prep, and then what we could do together across the continuum, and thinking of it in a different term of more than I'm going to work in my silo. So I think it was just worth sharing that collaboration has been really helpful for me personally in growth in my own work, and then how I implement it in teacher preparation.
And then thanks, Brian. I've got your email, and I will send that forward. Thank you for asking.
If it's okay, I wanted to kind of just real quick circle back a little bit to the discussion around that Laura had brought up around the issues around English learner and the importance of having sort of diverse people on your research teams, or when you do collaborations, that are actual people of color who have lived experiences that that can contribute to anti-racist work. Because knowing that, I think the last time I saw an article, it said 80% of teacher educators, not only just teachers, but also teacher educators, are white. I know that it could be challenging to actually get a team that is diverse. And I want to point out what happens if you don't. So the whole reason, to be quite honest, as to why the word English learner shows up on the Cal TPA, and this is not like a secret, that you can actually look up this information, is when you look up the team of developers who created the Cal TPA, and Karen and I were part of that team, you'll find that there were no experts on that team that were that had specialized in bilingual ed. No one. In fact, it was not a very diverse committee in the first place. And so when you don't have that, when you don't seek those types of opportunities to have that type of diverse group among advisors, you have these challenges that show up. And sure, I was there and I could have brought it up, but I was too busy trying to think about shifting the conversation from deficit to asset oriented, because that's like really the first step that teacher ed needs to actually confront. So I think that having, really being cognizant about that, and going back to what Gregory said about, you have to continue to show up and you have to continue to do the work. If you're white, if you're not Black, it's really easy to start doing the work, get frustrated or tired and fatigued, and step out, because it's not directly impacting you. As an Asian American, I can say that, sure, there are things that impact me as being Asian American, but I'm not Black. And so if I do work that looks at anti-Blackness, if I feel like there's too much pushback, I can step away and it won't affect me. But for some people, it's a matter of surviving. And so that's why I think it's really important that all of us, if we do this work and we commit to it, that we don't give up and that we continue to show up, even when we see that there is pushback, even though we get tired. And so I just wanted to point that out, those two things out. Thanks.
Thanks, Daniel. And I think that really points to the question of positionality, right? So, when we think about anti-racism, right? CCTE, we issued a particular statement on anti-Black racism, right? Because anti-Black racism and anti-indigeneity is the ground upon which this country was established. However, when we think about anti-racism in general, it impacts all of us. It impacts, as Daniel was talking about, he and I as Asian Americans, it impacts us differently, but it certainly impacts us. And it impacts, Latinx folks, it impacts white people, it impacts all of us in a society, but we have different positionalities and different options to opt in or out, depending on who we are in our society. And so I think it's really important what he said for us to always be considering what our position is. I know that some people have to kind of leave at 10 a.m. That's fine. I just want to give my blessings to all of you who feel like you want to drop out, or not want to, but need to, because you have other things that you need to do. And then we're going to continue this conversation. We're actually set to go until 10:30. But before we actually open it up a little bit more, Alan, I know that some people are interested in knowing where the recordings will be. So can we just make a little pause and find out a little bit more about the recordings, and then we'll come back into the conversation. So if people have more questions, feel ready to kind of jump in and ask. So Alan, can you give a brief update on where the recording will be posted?
Our expectation is that, again, it'll depend on how these turn out, but this group is obviously robust enough. This is going to be an excellent recording. We will put them on the CCTE YouTube channel probably in a week or two. I think we'll wait until we go through the whole week with all 5 groups, and then we'll do that. But yeah, and once we do that, we'll get a word out to everybody so that the membership knows where to find them.
Wonderful. Thank you so much. So I wanted to open it up to questions, conversation. You don't have to have a question. If there are things that were talked about during this last hour that you were like, oh, I wanted to address that, or, oh, maybe your research also comes in line with that, anything that the presenters inspired, because we're really here to learn from and with each other at these different points. We're all engaged in this inquiry around anti-racist teacher education practice, moving from pre-service all the way through induction and supporting the retention of diverse teachers in the field. So does anybody want to jump in with either a question or a comment, something for conversation? Now would be a great time to do so.
I have a question. What, and this is for anyone who'd like to answer, what do you do when your colleagues either say to you or show you that I don't want to do this? I don't think we should be trying to be anti-racist. We've been doing it this way for my entire life, and why do I need to change now? What's going to happen to my job if you start diversifying the faculty? You know, what do you say to them at that point?
Well, if you want a quick answer, I think you say it's time for you to retire.
I wish it was that easy.
I know.
Ernest, and again, I'm coming as a white female, right, who dominates K-12. But in my experience, I have talked about making sure that teacher education reflects the students that we are serving. And so again, to Betina's point, the positionality, I obviously am coming at it from a very different space, but in preparing my teacher candidates, I talk about how important it is for them to represent the TK through 12 population.
I don't know that I take that conversation on in a direct way. I think I take that conversation on in a more indirect way, because my goal is not to make people uncomfortable. My goal is to invite people into a conversation. And so it kind of leads to the question that I was going to raise, which is what we try very much to answer in the book on the redesign. So what we're trying to get people to participate in is a broader conversation that has to do with access and opportunities. Access and opportunities, like my tendency is to go to the benefit to the nation for the work that we do as teacher educators, because we in fact hold the future of the nation in our hands, because this nation is only as smart as the teachers who teach the nation. And we need all of our people to be smart. And so what I'm trying to communicate to my colleagues is their participation is as essential to this process as my participation or any other person of color's participation in the process. And so mine is an invitation to contribute. I may not be able to change how you're seeing the world or how you're feeling about who you are or how you fit into the world, but I can try to influence how you're contributing to the world. And so it's a kind of a different conversation that I'm not going to confront directly in an argument, because I can't win that argument. And so that's kind of how I see the process.
Adding on to that, I would say that in inviting people to contribute and in answering Ernest's question, I would say that a big part of it is the way that we look at how tenure track or tenured teacher educators at institutions are evaluated and promoted, and looking at and recognizing the work that they do that supports this kind of work, right? So if you actually recognize and support that work through elaborations or guidelines that support tenure around people who do this type of work, and you let that be an argument as to why they should be promoted or keep their job and stay another year, then people will start doing that work. If you have job calls with language in it that attracts the type of people that do this work, and then not only that, but you have a rubric that evaluates new tenure track faculty who do this type of work from a very critical way, then you can ensure that you will get these people who do this work not only superficially, but can do it very deeply. So it's a matter of not only looking at or changing mindsets, it is like inviting the right people to be part of your team, but doing it mindfully through the institution at which you work and the people that you hire and the people that you retain, if that makes sense.
And I just want to say, as somebody who has been transitioning from one institution to another for the last 6 months, I think in that transition process, Ernest, like as you're bringing in, as we are bringing in folks who are more critical and more anti-racist into programs that may not have traditionally been that way, I think there's a real need to support the people who are coming in, because especially as people are coming in, either as untenured or as junior faculty or as adjunct faculty, there's a tax placed upon those of us who are critical anti-racist educators. I know you and I know that well. We've talked about it, right? And so, there's a lot that I think having a critical person at the helm can do, but at the same time, there's a lot that the socialization around of people who are resistant to anti-racist pedagogies, because it's confronting, right? I mean, I think one of the things is it is hard, and I love Etta's approach to inviting people. We just recently did some work around, why are you in this work, right? What is your North Star? What is your vision, right? And building trust and moving at the speed of trust. If anybody's familiar with Adrienne Marie Brown's work, right? Emergent strategy, like that idea of building community and leadership, and it's slow and it's very painful for those of us who are deeply committed to this work, the like speed at which it happens, and it's taxing, right? Like it's exhausting for us because we feel our own energy being taken away. And so I know, like, you as a leader, I as a leader have made it a real commitment to like make sure to support the people that are engaging in the work, and then continuing to invite people in alignment with like, what is the part of the vision that you can come into, and then how can we begin to unpack the layers, right, of of racial dominance, right? Like of white supremacy that have been internalized in all of us, because that's what we've had to navigate in order to get to where we are. So, I think it's really challenging, and it doesn't move as fast as we want it to.
Listening to these comments, I'm thinking about another role, myself just being adjunct, so full-time at the county level. But I'm thinking about the role of site administrators and the message that they send and how they're talking to their staff. Built into the CAPES is a lot of opportunity, but we're not there yet. The Cal APA is a bit behind the Cal TPA. We certainly in the rubrics have the language and we have the intent, but Betina, it's slow moving as well. Our cut scores that were set were quite low. Those will be moving, but it's taken time. So anyone, I see Laura acknowledging that it's been slow. We're not there on the Cal TPA where we want to be, and we're not yet there either on the Cal APA. But just to think about that other group of folks who could be, and I think really is important in what they believe and how they're supporting their staff members and their newest staff members, their new teachers. So.
Other questions from folks? Ernest, I hope that gave some insight. I know it wasn't a question we could really answer, but I hope it helped you to know you're not alone, my friend and my brother.
But it is something we could start considering.
Yeah.
Like, how do we, if we're going to keep doing this work, we're going to encounter more and more people who don't want to do this work.
Yep.
So we do need to understand how we can continue to move forward when there are those that don't wish to move forward.
Yes, and I think that we as CCTE can create a space actually for people who do want to move forward to actually really dig in earnest on like, how do we do this work in the face of resistance? That was actually one of the original questions I had, but then I didn't, we kind of shifted in the conversation based on where the papers were. I know Elaine is in the room and she asked if she could respond. And I just want to say, yes, Elaine, please jump in. We would love to hear your voice.
Thank you so much. I'm Greg Richardson's wife. And just so you don't think I'm just coming in off the street, I'm recently retired from APU. I was the director of the Office of Women's Development, involved with the Diversity Collaboration Committee, adjunct professor, and I'm a psychologist. But this has been phenomenal. This has just been phenomenal. But Ernest, what I want to say to you may have a different lens. And even though I'm in higher ed, sometimes my perspective is different. But for starters, I would love if there are particular faculty members or colleagues who are feeling just stuck, is hear them out completely. And sometimes it's hard because we think what they're saying is just so ridiculous that how are you even thinking like that? But hear them out completely, because I think part of the problem is they may feel unheard in this space. And so if you hear them out and then you begin to think about not rebutting them, not coming up with a response for everything they say, but invite them into a conversation where I want to hear you, I want to understand you, I want to get to know what the issues are, because at the end of the day, what we're doing is making a space for our students to do better. Because as someone said, we're teaching the nation, we're making a space, and it has to be about the students, not about ego, not about tenure, not about any of those things. So if we begin to hear them, then we can do the planning of how we're going to structure classes and organizations and workshops and meetings about rebutting that. But it's going to take hearing, understanding, and moving forward, and of course, never giving up the work. So thank you for letting me crash your party.
Elaine, that was beautiful. You can crash any party I'm ever a part of. Thank you for bringing your voice to the room. And I think that connects really well to the question that Keith dropped in the chat, which is how do we differentiate between those who really do not want to do the work versus those who are paralyzed by fear of change and the new and the different, and those who, maybe worried about like the loss that happens when they take on anti-racist pedagogies, or as they're kind of approaching this topic. And I think that's a really good question. And I think Elaine started us off really well through like listening authentically to where people are at. But I'm wondering if the other presenters have some thoughts, or if anybody in the room has some thoughts about how we do that work, those of us, we're all supporting teachers in some capacity, or teacher candidates. And many of us are faculty members or working with colleagues who may feel resistant. How do we support them? Or how do we differentiate?
It just seems to me that I want to go back to what Elaine was saying, because I think that there's a good connection between perspectives there. I think that we have to use what we understand about people and psychology with whomever it is that we're dealing, because our goal is ultimately to create a team that is inclusive. And to me, in many ways, teaching children and working with adults is not that different. So in teaching children, I have to connect with what they know and what they value. And I do that kind of selectively as I'm inviting the children to learn something new. I want to make it real. I want to make it meaningful. And when I'm engaged with people in transforming pre-service teacher preparation, which includes all forms of diversity, from the beginning to the end of the program design, there are certainly people in the group always that I'm working with who are radically, sometimes radically racist. But I don't need to have them destroy the work that we're doing, and I don't need them to be peripheral to it. I need them to be central to it. And so I have to understand what it is they value, and I have to make them feel welcome in the group. I don't want them to feel criticized or marginalized. And if you look at some of the work that we have been able to do in transforming pre-service teacher preparation and how we've gone for the central factors, like, how do you prepare English teachers so that English teachers actually have the background knowledge necessary to teach a diverse English curriculum in high school? What is the subject matter preparation? We've actually changed the subject matter preparation and the pedagogy that we're providing as tools for facilitating learning in a non-racist context. But we first had to get rid of the racist curriculum that they would be delivering, that standard racist curriculum. And we have that whole situation of how do we begin to get the science people to understand that there's more than just Western science, that there's ancestral knowledge from all of these different groups. How do we begin to get them to understand that without hitting them over the head with a sledgehammer and making them resist? So I'm just saying that we need to use the psychology that we know about interacting with people, connecting with what people value, what people know, and building that in some way that actually helps us to move toward our goals. I think that is the thing that sort of stops us. And in some sense, I think that if we get too far in terms of how we want people to change their ideologies without a greater focus on changing their practice, I think we sort of lose the battle. Because right now I'm really worried because we have all kinds of programs out there that are intended to teach teachers how to teach underserved, underrepresented groups. The children still can't read. And the way these programs are focused on anti-racism, what the children learn to do is struggle, not learn to read. And that becomes a real problem for me. And now I'm off the soapbox.
I can chime in right there. Thank you, Etta. I'd like to comment on what Etta said and go back to something that was said earlier also about the question of how do you get people to get involved that do not want to be involved in this work. At my former institution, I was the diversity chair of the Faculty Diversity Council for 3 years. And we had faculty from every college represented. And one of the things that we were looking to do in the area of diversity was to open up that box where people can see that we have inequities existing in the system and to help faculty to understand how to maneuver through this difficult terrain and to help their students in their growth and development. And one of the things that the Diversity Council wanted to do was to put a question on the IDA, which was basically the students evaluating the faculty on their teaching expertise and so forth. And that question would address how well the faculty addressed and basically maneuvered through difficult issues surrounding inequities, race, and so forth. And I mention that because there was a big pushback from faculty. And one of the things that we learned was that, one, as a group, we had to take those individuals that were difficult and didn't want to change and define where they had value and to incorporate their value and help them to understand how significant and important it was to take their worth in that particular area and move it along with the way things were changing in the nation. That our nation that existed 200 years ago is not what we have today, and that we need to change based upon our population and the demographics that we have, not just ethnicity-wise, but we have the students with disabilities and other groups. There are a number of groups out there. And when we begin to do that, then we begin to see that accompanied with the workshops that we had that were open and non-critical, that faculty begin to change their perspective on how they thought previously.
Great, thank you. Thank you so much, Greg. And Etta, any other closing thoughts? Any thoughts on, any other thoughts on Keith's question about differentiating, or whether it's important to even differentiate between those two categories, how we might address it if we did differentiate before we kind of do our wrap up? And Keith, feel free to chime in if you want to clarify on your question. I see you turned your camera on, so jump in.
And I'm sorry I'm late, and I really appreciate the comments from Gregory, Elaine, and Etta, because one of the things that just strikes me is the gap between our actions and and our own ideology or our own beliefs or our own perceptions. And I work primarily, over the last few years, I work primarily with teachers that are in the very first courses of a credential program. And I'm amazed at how dedicated they are to doing things right, but at the same time are paralyzed in regards to admitting that they don't know everything. And what's really kind of ironic is the more experience a person has in relationship to substitute teaching or coaching or working, in any kind of youth group, Sunday school, tutoring type of scenario, it's really interesting that many of the people with the greatest amount of experience have the greatest fear in admitting that they're not perfect. And one of the things, and I've done a lot of accreditation visits, and one of the things that strikes me is how little effort we spend working with our candidates' own social emotional development and getting them to acknowledge the fact that I feel this way and this is propelling me to do something. And what I fear is sometimes that when we are too theoretical, scientifically oriented, dogmatic, we actually build into this fear that I can't be vulnerable. Where is the space for a student to say, you know what, I know that there's this injustice, but I don't know what to do about it. And it terrifies me. That runs in direct conflict with this idea that you have to be the teacher, you have to be in charge, you have to be the person that walks into the classroom ready to take over on day one. So, it's this idea of providing space for candidates to be vulnerable and for candidates to grapple with the gaps between their words, their actions, and their beliefs. And so, that's just kind of where my question came from, is how do we provide space, not only with our candidates, but with our colleagues?
Thanks, Keith. That's a beautiful, beautiful question and intention and space. And Lara, I know you dropped a couple things in the chat. Did you want to elaborate? I saw that you unmuted real quick.
Yeah, just Keith, a lot of what you're talking about, first of all, really resonates. I've worked with the Center for Reaching and Teaching the Whole Child on updating their their social, emotional, culturally responsive pedagogy work. And I think what you're kind of blending your statement with the other statements and questions, I think we really need to acknowledge the fact that trust is extremely important. And as I think several people have said, listening to other people with respect and an attempt to understand is really important to that trust building process. But then also being willing to be reciprocally vulnerable. I haven't had all my coffee yet this morning, but modeling for our students, if we're afraid to make mistakes, if we as teacher educators, as induction leaders, as educators, period, if we are afraid to show our own vulnerability, how are we teaching our students to be willing to say, you know what, gosh, what I just said, that was really racist, right? Like, owning is important, and us modeling and setting up skills, and then giving our candidates the opportunity to use those skills so that when they are faced with a situation in a classroom, they feel like they've had some sort of experience, at least in knowing what to think or do or how to lead that conversation. Like, leading courageous conversations is very difficult work, and I'm very, very lucky that I have worked with some amazing K-12 educators and administrators, Chuck Gary, Beverly James, who, unless you know Milpitas, you may not know those two people, but they're amazing human beings who really taught me a lot about respect and listening through their work. And I think that it's really important for us to model these things we're saying, not just say them. So.
Thank you so much, Lara. So I just want to close us out. We are almost at our time. That hour and a half just sped by. It was just a really important and powerful conversation that was had around the research of our invited presenters today. And I think it led in a really powerful direction. I'm reminded by Keith's question and Lara's response of humanizing pedagogies, right? And the importance of centering the humanity of teachers, learners, all people in the space. And I mean, I think Edda's talk around, making sure that, part of cultural responsiveness, part of anti-racism is holding students also to high standards, but inviting in our colleagues, right? There's just been so much richness that has been brought in this last hour and a half. I just like to close us out by inviting presenters to please, if you're comfortable sharing an email address or a Twitter handle or ways that people can continue to keep in touch with you, find out more about your research, anything that you feel like you'd like to share in the chat, please feel free to do so as we close up. Again, as Alan had mentioned, at 10 o'clock, this will be posted eventually on our CCTE YouTube channel. And we'll also be sharing out the recordings of that on Twitter. I know for a fact because Karen and I co-moderate the Twitter account for CCTE. So it'll be out there for you to come and revisit these conversations, because as somebody mentioned, I think it was Melissa who mentioned, this is a start, right? Like in 4 months or a 4 to 6 week inquiry or however long you're taking, this is only a start, right? Becoming an anti-racist teacher educator is a lifelong journey and something that we all are continuing to learn and grow in. So if we can do that in community, let's do all that. It is 10:30, my friends. I wish you a wonderful rest of your day. Please join us the rest of the week. We start at 10 a.m. So 10 a.m. Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday, Friday for excellent research conversations. And you should have that in your email alongside this announcement. And thank you again to all the presenters who came to share your work. Your research is really powerful. Appreciate you all.
Betina,
I will see you in our...
Can I say three quick things as we
Alan, I can't deny you. You are the institutional heart of CCTE, so please.
Well, first, I'd like to thank everybody for taking part, and Betina for your moderating. It's really been a better session than we ever had any reason to expect. So really, really great. Secondly, this is a part of the theme that's going to come into the fall conference this year. The committee that's working on that is wrestling with the terms intersectionality and inclusion and all different things that fit into that. So the research you're all doing is going to fit right in there too. So keep in touch with that and see where it fits for you. And then finally, let's all be thinking about what is the future research agenda for California teacher education. What kind of things do we need to know more about? And many of the topics you're already working on fit into that as well. So as Betina said, share ideas back and forth. You know who you are. Keep in touch and let us know what you're thinking about. And thank you all for being here.